Howdy folks, John Adamson, the Rehab and Documentation Guru, making a brief video on reasonable care. I'm actually going to be teaching a course on maintenance therapy tonight. And so anyway, won't spend a lot of time on this topic. So far, I've covered safety and efficacy and how to prove that, some basic things to think about when you're trying to prove that so you can get paid for what you do. But another thing you have to prove is that your care is reasonable. And so the main thing I want you to think about when you're talking about care being reasonable is return on investment. So for the dollars spent, is the outcome justified? I'll give you, for instance, in the therapy realm that you might find useful. In therapy, there are different interventions, specifically between PT and OT, that overlap. And two in common are therapeutic exercise, or 97110, and also therapeutic activities, or 97530. And if you've looked at the fee schedules of third-party payers, you'll probably note that therapeutic activities pays significantly more, several dollars more per unit. And in fact, you could be looking at $20, $25 more per hour if you were to bill out for a whole hour, which I wouldn't recommend because that's probably excessive therapy, but it does add up over time significantly. So why did I pick those two codes? Because when you look at the definitions of 97110 and 97530, there is overlap. And in fact, there are some course educators out there that talk about how to appropriately bill for these things and maximize your dollar value and utilize therapeutic activities. But I will say, because I have a course on each one of these, I'm very careful to point out the distinction between them, even though they can be used generally for similar things. Therapeutic exercise, for instance, works on strength. Well, you can do strengthening activities and bill it under therapeutic activities. You can do things that are dynamic and require flexibility or range of motion, and that would require either one of those, perhaps. They could be covered by either. And then lastly is endurance, and therapeutic activities can be done to endurance. So the question is, and this is the reasonable aspect of care, if both codes can do the same thing, then why would I build a more expensive code to get the same outcome? That doesn't make sense. I've used the analogy of buying a car. If all I want to do related to driving a car is get from point A to point B, and a Chevrolet will work just as well as a Rolls-Royce in accomplishing that, why would I pay? Well, some Chevys are running astronomically expensive now, but why would I pay 10 times the amount of money when my only requirement is moving from point A to point B? It's not reasonable to suggest that I should pay a lot more if that is the sole outcome. And when it comes to third-party payment, the insurance company is just looking at a bare necessity of functional improvement. And so if two interventions can do the same thing from an outcomes perspective, it is not going to be reasonable in their eyes to bill for a much more expensive intervention. And so even though therapeutic activities is, I think it runs about $7 per unit in the United States, more expensive. I see I had somebody from Russia or Russian on here. It doesn't make sense. It's not reasonable to go with that higher charged item. We see this in more expensive medical terms, where, let's say, a surgery to repair a joint can be done at a quarter the cost, and research shows it has the same outcomes as a more new technology. Why would an insurance want to pay for that? And so a big aspect of proving reasonableness is that it's worth spending more for more outcome. Now, the question might be is, well, what if my outcomes are double, twice as good with another intervention that costs 10% more. Well, you might say that sounds pretty reasonable, but what if your outcomes with a different product were only 10% better, but it costs twice as much? Well, the reasonable proposition doesn't seem as good in that case, does it? So there's a lot of nuance, especially when you're talking about high dollar healthcare, to proving the reasonableness of your care. And since most of my audience is therapists, are therapists, PT, OT, and speech, even though we don't have that quite high dollar value, we do need to be mindful that third-party payers are looking at, did you keep the reasonableness, the costliness in mind for achieving the outcomes that you're asking to be paid for? And so anyway, just some basic thoughts on that. Hope you're doing well. Take care and God bless.